Here's what you're missing over at patreon.com/Addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we have someone who's been on the show before. And he was on to talk about his father's work, The Killer Angels. But this time, we're talking about his work. And today we're going to focus on the book, Gods and Generals. I'm sure you've all read it. If you haven't, you should. Jeff Shaara. Jeff Shaara, welcome.
Thank you.
Again.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. All right. So I was rereading parts of the book last night, and the one thing I kept wondering was how much work it takes to write something like this. The research that you have to do, right? You have to have the history correct, do you not?
Well, I had a well-known historian say to me that because of what I'm doing, because I'm writing a novel,
right.
So it's fiction.
Sure.
And he said, you don't have to worry about the history. You can write anything you want. Well, okay, maybe that's the way some novelists approach it. They just, they make history fit their story.
Right.
I very definitely want to get the history right. Get the facts straight first, and then we'll try to build a story, a good story around those facts. That's my whole goal in every book I've done. That's been the approach that I take.
Mm-hmm. The scenes that you depict the different characters in. Like, for example, when Lee and Taylor are in Richmond in the office one, I believe it's during the Peninsula Campaign before Lee takes command.
Right.
And, the conversations they're having and Lee looking out the window and then he gets out and he leaves with Marshall to go and check out what's going on at the front. How much of the dialogue is imagined, or is there a balance between things that we know that these people said, and then maybe you're creating a scene to put those words in their mouths, but not necessarily the way they said them or when they said them?
There's definitely a balance, and it has to work out the way where we know certain conversations, well documented and things. Now, what the scene you referred to really is not that well documented. Walter Taylor's book is a fabulous resource, and that was one of the many resources that I used. And so you get to know Taylor. It's my job, get into his head, become familiar with the way he sees things, the way he describes Lee and his relationship with Lee, and then sort of build on that. But my job as the storyteller is to fill in the blanks, to go from what we know happened, what exactly, as exact as we can make it, the dialogue or certain conversations or certain scenes, and then fill in the blanks with things that we don't know and have it be seamless. Because if you can tell, when the scene goes from being perfectly historically accurate to totally made up, and it stands out like a sore thumb, I'm not doing my job.
Right.
And the book just doesn't work.
Right. Who do you decide are the main characters that we're going to follow in these books? Now, I would imagine with Gods and Generals, since it's a prequel to The Killer Angels, you're kind of going along with what your dad had already done, right?
When Ted Turner's people approached me about continuing the story that my father started in The Killer Angels, which is just the Battle of Gettysburg,
right,
but go before and after with a lot of the same characters, well, that was my template right there.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew Lee certainly was one of the characters, and on the other side, you've got Chamberlain and Hancock, where my father didn't really use Hancock as a character. He used Armistead instead. Well, I chose to use Hancock. I wanted to balance the North and the South, have the same number of primary characters. The problem came when I ran into Longstreet, because Longstreet is a primary character in my father's story, but I didn't find the same Longstreet he did. I couldn't relate to the kind of Longstreet that he created in The Killer Angels. And then I realized that the character who I needed to explore, who was there much more of the time and who is a fabulous counterpoint to Lee, is Stonewall Jackson. And so that's how Jackson became my character.
Okay.
And I sort of adapted that. But all the way through, I'm very aware that one of the things my father did brilliantly was to straddle the fence. It's not a Northern book. It's not a Southern book.
Right.
There's no bias. You're right down the middle because you've got characters on both sides giving you their perspectives as they saw it. And I knew I had to do the same thing. Keep in mind, too, Gods and Generals is the first book I ever wrote.
Right.
I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah, because you weren't an author before this, right?
Not at all.
Right.
I had never written anything before, and that's not false modesty. I mean, I was never a writer. I was a dealer in rare coins down in Tampa, Florida, when I started this. So, I had to use my father's experience as the template to get started with that and to take the characters and the way my father did, the kind of research my father did, the personal research, getting into the heads of the characters whenever possible. It does me very little good to read a modern biography of somebody because you're getting the biographer's point of view.
Right.
You need to get back and hear the voices, and so I knew that. I knew that that's an important part of the research. So going back and then finding these characters, and then again walking down the middle, walking right on the fence, and that's a difference between, I think, the book and the movie. The movie Gods and Generals tends to focus much more on the Confederates than I would have liked, and whereas the book is definitely told from both sides.
We're going to get to the movie in a bit, but so I'm more impressed now that you told me that you were not even a writer before you did this, because a friend of mine is a musician, and when I started doing the show, I said, can you do your version, your take on this song? And I sent him Gary Owen because it's my favorite song from the era. And so he came up with a really good version of it and everything. And he told me afterwards, we were having a conversation. I said, the audience really likes it. You should do a full album of Civil War songs in your style. I'll send you some songs and stuff. And he called me back after a couple days of thinking about it. And he said, people, my whole career, have always come up to me and said, you should do this. And I go, oh, thank you. And then I keep going because it's not from me. And so I can't take someone else's idea because it won't come out genuine. It won't be good. He goes, but yours is the first idea that I like and that I think I'm going to try to do. And I will try to do this album. And he did. It took a year and a half, but it came out great. So my question to you is, how did you, at the suggestion of other people, suddenly go from coin collector or dealer to author, successful author?
Well, I was at a sort of a changing point in my life. I mean, I had sold my business down in Florida, and I was looking kind of for something else to do and wasn't really sure. And this sort of happened serendipitously. I mean, Gettysburg comes out. The movie comes out in 1993. The movie's enormously successful, made my father's book a #1 bestseller. And the word I got from Ron Maxwell, the film director, was that Ted Turner wants to make more movies. Wouldn't it be great, to take your father's book, go in both directions, before and after, with a lot of the same characters, because Ted wants to make movies. So, the conversation we had was that it should start from a book. So the prequel and sequel should be books first. Well, again, I'd never written anything before, but I thought it was something I'd like to try to do. But the key was the conversation we had, which is that if whatever I come up with stinks, it goes in the trash. I mean, nobody will ever see it.
Right.
That's why there was no fear. Because I've had people ask me all the time, weren't you afraid? How did you know how to write a book? I had no idea. Right. But I knew it was something I'd like to try to do. And if it failed, it failed. And that was the end of it. So there was no expectation. There was no, anxiety about it. I knew I would put a story together the way my father had done The Killer Angels. Like I said before, the personal research, getting into the heads of the characters, putting words in the mouths of important historical characters is a risky thing to do. Right. Because they had better be the right word. Yeah. Because people care. Yes. And so I knew that. And I knew that, okay, pay attention, and don't play around. This isn't your story. This is their story. So, with that approach, I just started working on it, and the way this evolved, as I was getting my way through the manuscript, I'm the businessman in the family, so I'm representing my father's estate. My father has long passed away now, and with his publisher, Random House in New York, Killer Angels is a #1 bestseller, so I'm talking to these people fairly often, and I told them what I was doing. I said, I'm working on the prequel to Killer Angels. It's called Gods and Generals, and their response was, oh, well, why don't you send us the manuscript? Well, okay, I'll send you the manuscript. Again, with no expectation. And this was September of 1995, and I sent him off the manuscript. The response I got back was, "We don't care if it's a movie. We like the book. We think you're a writer. Here's a contract."
Wow.
That changed my whole life. I mean,
I bet it did.
That was a surprise. Gods and Generals comes out, debuts on the bestseller list. Now, I'm under no illusions that the great American author has arrived. I mean, I know full well that people were cutting me slack. They wanted more of the Killer Angels.
Right.
People wanted more. And if this was close, resembled Killer Angels in any way, people were happy about it. The critics cut me slack all over the country. The publisher sent me out on a tour, a 59-city book signing tour, all over the country, because they wanted to introduce me as not the father. This is the son. This is not the father.
Right.
And so I was all over the country, and I had a very tough time standing up in front of an audience and holding up a copy of Gods and Generals and saying, "Oh, look what I did." This was tough. And a psychologist could have a field day with this, I'm sure. But, this was my father's book. Sure. This is the book he deserved the opportunity to write, and it sort of fell on me. And it took me a while to accept that maybe this is my book. Maybe Gods and Generals is my work. Everywhere I would go, when I would talk to audiences at bookstores and so forth, I would talk about my father. And finally, a good friend of mine out in Los Angeles, did an event out there, and the guy said to me afterward, he said, "I'm kind of tired of hearing about your father. I really want to hear about you."
Yeah.
And I had to sort of stop and think about that for a minute. Well, okay, maybe I should change my approach here.
Well, so did you feel like an imposter?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. I'm not the writer. My father's the writer.
Right.
And people are praising Gods and Generals, which is a very nice thing, but I didn't really believe it. I thought they were mistaking me for Killer Angel.
Yes.
And it was a little odd. Like I say, I'm sure a psychologist would just go nuts with this.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, no, and the reason I ask is because I have a lot of those same feelings with the show. And when I hear things from people that are nice, they're nice to hear. But I'm like, who are you talking about? I don't understand it. And so I don't have the, shadow of my father thing going on. It's just my own, I guess, insecurities, or I don't know what it is. But how long did it take you before you finally said, okay, this is mine? Like, this success, this praise, all of this is mine.
It took longer than you might think. It took until I did my books on the American Revolution.
So you had to get out of the Civil War.
Right. My fourth and fifth books, which is the 2-book set, Rise to Rebellion and The Glorious Cause, because my father never did anything on the American Revolution.
Right.
And when those books, I was on the Today Show with Rise to Rebellion. I was on the cover of USA Today on the front page, a real nice story. The book was number 2 on Amazon when it came out. It was a little easier for me to say, wow, I guess that's for me. That's my book. And it did take a while, but I didn't feel so much like an imposter anymore.
Yeah, and that makes sense. You have to get out of the field that your dad was known in and do your own thing. Like mental, even though you're doing your own thing with Gods and Generals, it's still the Civil War. So maybe you have a little doubt in your mind that, I'm just copying Dad here.
Well, plus, the book is a direct connection to the Killer Angels.
Right.
It's the prequel. And The Last Full Measure, which is the next book, is the sequel.
Yeah.
So it's a trilogy now around my father's book. So my father's book is the centerpiece of the trilogy. So it's fine. It's perfectly legitimate for me to view this as my father's trilogy.
Sure.
Without him, this never would have happened. And had he lived, had he not died, he was only 59 when he died. Heart disease. Had he not died, these would have been his books to write.
Right.
They would have gone to him and say, let's do the prequel and the sequel to Killer Angels, and by all rights, it would have been his project.
Sure. Yeah, it's amazing how life changes that way. So, all right, now, I mean, obviously, these being the prequel and the sequel, Last Full Measure being the sequel, you want to keep the, what do you call it, the style of your father's writing, right? But you've adapted that to all of your other books as well. You feel comfortable there, or had you ever tried to write outside of that style?
Well, my father, I wouldn't call it style so much as format.
That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
My father.
Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.